I don't know about you, but when I think about Nintendo, I tend to think about handhelds. That's always been the area where the company seems most comfortable, even dating all the way back to the original Game & Watch line in the early 1980s. While Nintendo's home consoles have had their share of ups and downs, with the N64, GameCube, and especially the Wii U all struggling commercially in their day, the company's handhelds have consistently been industry leaders. The Nintendo DS and the original Game Boy remain the two best-selling handheld consoles in history, and in fact rank among the best-selling consoles, period. The only handheld that ever came close to competing with those numbers was Sony's PSP. And before any of you bring it up, the Switch is technically considered a hybrid console, not a handheld, so it doesn't count. With that in mind, it can be hard to imagine a time when Nintendo's handheld dominance wasn't completely secure, but there were moments when the company actually had to stop and reconsider their approach. The early 90s saw decent competition from Sega's Game Gear, for example, but I think one of their bigger moments of self-reflection came in the mid-90s, in the wake of what is still widely considered Nintendo's most infamous misfire, the Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy was kind of a disaster of a console. Its tripod-mounted visor forced the player to lean forward and stare into a headset resting on a table. This was not only awkward and uncomfortable, but it also meant the machine was far less portable than Nintendo's marketing suggested. The harsh red and black visuals were notorious for causing eye strain and headaches, sometimes after only a few minutes of use, and the isolated Viewmaster-esque design made multiplayer essentially impossible. You couldn't even watch someone else play. Unsurprisingly, the system was a commercial disaster. The Virtual Boy is to this day Nintendo's biggest flop, and its failure left them scrambling to recover. But as the company's internal resources were already tied up finishing development on the N64, there simply wasn't enough time to design an entirely new handheld platform from scratch. Complicating matters further was the departure of Gunpei Yokoi, the legendary creator of the Game Boy and one of Nintendo's most influential engineers. Contrary to popular myth, Yokoi was not forced out in disgrace over the Virtual Boy's failure. In reality, he had long planned to leave Nintendo at age 55 in order to return to his roots, making smaller experimental projects as a freelance designer. Nonetheless, his departure sent shockwaves through the industry, and Nintendo's stock value dipped noticeably in response. Making matters worse, a year later in 1997, Bandai released the WonderSwan, a handheld system designed by Yokoi himself. The WonderSwan was more powerful than the Game Boy, cheaper to manufacture, and incredibly efficient, running for up to 40 hours on just a single AA battery. Seeing this, Nintendo knew they needed a new handheld system to compete, but with Yokoi gone and most of Nintendo's engineering resources tied up with the N64, they had to move quickly. Lucky for them, the release of Pokémon in 1996 had already bought them a bit of time. The monster-collecting RPG became a global phenomenon almost overnight, breathing a second life into the aging Game Boy brand. This, paired with the sleeker Game Boy Pocket released the same year, helped in smoothing things over in the wake of the Virtual Boy's poor reception. Still, Pokémon wouldn't be enough. Nintendo knew they needed a new Game Boy successor, but lacking proper time or resources, they would have to come up with a stopgap. And so the company revisited an earlier prototype known internally as Project Atlantis, a scrapped attempt from the early 1990s to develop a color successor to the Game Boy. That prototype had been scrapped for being too complex and expensive, but Nintendo decided its basic concept was still viable. By simplifying the design, namely by reducing the proposed 32-bit processor down to something closer to the existing Game Boy's 8-bit architecture, Nintendo was able to create a system that felt new enough to be marketed as an evolution of their current hardware. The result was the Game Boy Color. On the surface, the Game Boy Color lived up to its name in the most literal way. It was a color-capable Game Boy. Same basic architecture, same bit count, same button layout, same audio capabilities. Physically, it fell somewhere between the original Game Boy and the slimmer Game Boy Pocket. Slightly thicker and taller than the Pocket, but still significantly more compact than the fat old Game Boy. In addition, it ran on just 2 AA batteries, as opposed to the original Game Boy's 4 or the Pocket's 2 AAAs. Under the hood, though, the Color did feature a processor roughly twice as fast as the original Game Boys, and perhaps more importantly, the system maintained full backward compatibility with the entire existing Game Boy library. This would prove to be a crucial factor in the console's eventual success, as players weren't forced to abandon their old games with the upgrade to a new console. And the faster processor meant that any games made exclusively for the Color could be more technologically advanced than before. But of course, the real draw was the screen. The Game Boy Color could display up to 56 colors simultaneously, a dramatic improvement over the original Game Boy's 4 shades of green. Like the Super Game Boy, the system also allowed players to apply preset color palettes to older monochrome games, By holding certain directional and button combinations during startup, the player could remap the original 4 shades into different color schemes, giving classic titles a surprisingly fresh look. The Game Boy Color launched with 3 titles: Pocket Bomberman, Wario Land 2, and Tetris DX. Of those, Tetris DX was arguably the smartest move. The original Tetris had arguably been the reason for the Game Boy's early success, so releasing a colorful new version alongside the new hardware was a savvy way to evoke nostalgia while showcasing the system's upgraded display. Nintendo also began releasing enhanced ports of classic NES games. With the addition of color support, the Game Boy was now finally capable of producing faithful one-to-one conversions of NES titles, and Nintendo demonstrated this with titles the likes of Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. These Deluxe, or DX, titles quickly became a trend on the Game Boy Color, enhanced re-releases of classic Game Boy titles that added full-color support, along with small gameplay tweaks or new features. One of the most notable examples of this was The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX, and this title in particular served a dual purpose. Not only was it another updated, colorized re-release of a classic Game Boy title, but it also arrived shortly after the launch of Ocarina of Time on the N64, helping further propel the return of the Zelda franchise after a 5-year drought. In the DX version of Link's Awakening, Nintendo added a brand new area very creatively named the Color Dungeon, filled with puzzles built around color matching mechanics. Completing the dungeon rewards the player with a choice between 2 new tunics that double either Link's attack or defense. The dungeon even uses an arrangement of the classic Zelda 1 dungeon theme for that extra bit of nostalgia. There's also a charming new photograph side quest. At certain moments throughout the adventure, you can pose for snapshots that are stored in an in-game album, and if you happen to own a Game Boy printer, you can even print them out if that's your type of thing. They even added a new pop-up menu to your inventory screen that shows your current tunic, how many total photos you found, and how many heart pieces you've collected toward your next full container. Notably, Link's Awakening DX isn't actually exclusive to the Game Boy Color. The game can still be played on the original Game Boy, and you can even enter the Color Dungeon. But since the puzzles there rely on distinguishing between colors, you're not likely to get past the first room. But other than that, the experience is essentially identical. The DX version doesn't change the original gameplay or graphical assets at all, and that includes the occasional annoying quirk, such as the repetitive power-up music. Still, the addition of color does wonders for the game's atmosphere. Areas like the mysterious forest now appear in dark nighttime tones, a detail the original Game Boy wasn't really able to convey. Much to my surprise, Nintendo also tweaked the game's ending. You still have to beat the game without any game overs to get the true ending, but this time, Marin's fate is made less ambiguous. Where the original The End card was over a black screen with a winged Marin flying across the screen, the DX version is made more explicit. We actually see Marin transform into a seagull, fulfilling the wish she mentioned earlier in the story. Whether that's an improvement is debatable, since the ambiguity of the original ending had its own charm, but it was still an interesting change that I never noticed before now. Also, there's this photo. This just made me smile. Link's Awakening DX is one of those instances where an updated release effectively renders the original obsolete. But that's also partly because Nintendo kinda just released the same game twice on the same console. The Game Boy Color was, after all, extremely similar to the original Game Boy in terms of architecture and capabilities. As a result, the transition to color didn't require any compromises to the game's presentation or performance. If anything, nearly every change made to Link's Awakening DX was a subtle improvement. In fact, those changes proved so subtle that some critics couldn't help feeling a little underwhelmed. The game still reviewed well overall, but that was largely because it was a re-release of an already beloved title. In terms of brand new content, the DX version was sometimes criticized for making only minimal efforts to distinguish itself from the original. While the colorization itself was widely praised, the new Color Dungeon didn't impress everyone. One reviewer even called it kinda lame. Some also argued that the new color-based puzzles should have been integrated into the existing dungeons rather than just being confined to one new optional area. Retrospectively though, Link's Awakening DX is widely considered the definitive version of the game. It removes nothing from the original while layering optional bonuses on top. About the only improvement I personally wish they had made was to the save system. Just like the original, you have to press every button at once to bring up the save menu, and saving the game boots you back to the title screen, a process that feels archaic even for 1998. But overall, unless you're a collector, there's really no question about which version of Link's Awakening most players should choose today. In many ways, the reception to Link's Awakening DX mirrors the reception to the Game Boy Color as a whole, an incremental upgrade that effectively replaced the original without truly surpassing it. Upon its release, the Game Boy Color was widely praised for its compact size and, of course, its new color screen. The new display looked noticeably clear and lacked the smeary motion blur of the old pea-soup Game Boy. Even so, some found the system's color palette to be a bit more muted than they expected, tending toward grounded, earthy tones rather than the brighter, more saturated colors they might have hoped for. The lack of a backlit screen was also a common point of criticism. To be fair, adding a backlight would have significantly increased both the cost of the system and its battery consumption, two areas where Nintendo had always been careful to maintain an advantage. Still, competing handhelds like the Atari Lynx and Sega Game Gear had featured backlit displays as far back as 1989, so seeing Nintendo's newest handheld still lacking one in 1998 felt more than a little behind the times. The biggest criticism, though, was the system's continued reliance on 8-bit graphics at a point in time when many competing handhelds had already moved on to 16 bits. Bandai's WonderSwan, which was the Game Boy's largest direct competitor in Japan, may have been black and white at first, but it ran 16-bit graphics on just a single AA battery, and with a far lower price tag to boot. In many respects, the WonderSwan felt like a truer successor to the original Game Boy, right down to the fact that it had been designed by Gunpei Yokoi himself. By comparison, the Game Boy Color could sometimes feel like a stopgap release, hastily assembled in the aftermath of the Virtual Boy, a system meant to buy Nintendo time until the eventual arrival of the Game Boy Advance. By 1998, we were already seeing more interesting and powerful handhelds, such as the Neo Geo Pocket, and while the explosive popularity of Pokémon had successfully revitalized the Game Boy brand, many developers had already lost interest in the aging portable and began shifting their attention toward newer hardware. Still, despite all of these criticisms, the Game Boy Color was an undeniable success. Even the WonderSwan, its most direct competitor, only managed to capture about 8% of the handheld market at its peak. The Game Boy Color itself had a relatively short lifespan of just under 3 years, existing largely as a bridge between the original Game Boy and the eventual Game Boy Advance. But in that short window, it completely dominated the market. Backwards compatibility, strong brand recognition, and the lingering momentum of Pokémon proved more than enough to keep Nintendo firmly on top. And once the Game Boy Advance arrived, Nintendo would continue to hold this near monopoly over the handheld space for years, until Sony entered the market with the PSP in 2004. Looking back today, the entire Game Boy family represents one of gaming's biggest success stories. The original Game Boy succeeded because it prioritized practicality over raw power, namely long battery life and affordability. As a result, Nintendo dominated handhelds for an entire decade, even as their home consoles faced increasingly fierce competition from the likes of Sega's Genesis and Sony's PlayStation. Altogether, the Game Boy line, that being the original, the Pocket, and the Color combined, is the second highest-selling handheld in history, behind only the DS, and the fourth best-selling console overall. At more than 118 million units worldwide, it dwarfs sales of all other handhelds of its era, and it is not even close. So was the Game Boy Color truly necessary? Well, I suppose that depends. It didn't radically reinvent handheld gaming, nor did it push hardware boundaries in dramatic ways. But after the embarrassment of the Virtual Boy, Nintendo needed something that could reassure players and developers that the Game Boy brand still had a future. Even as Nintendo's home console sales dwindled as we approached the new millennium, the Game Boy line continued to not only survive, but thrive, eventually paving the way for more unique and influential handhelds such as the Nintendo DS and even the Switch. It wasn't the flashiest handheld they ever made, but it showed that Nintendo almost always finds a way to land on its feet, and stands as proof that Nintendo and handheld gaming will perhaps forever be synonymous. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate the support. Again, I don't usually do the whole call to action thing, but I just wanted to kind of update you guys on the state of the channel because we just passed 5,000 subscribers, which is, you know, a pretty big milestone for this channel. I was stuck at 4,000 for so long. I honestly thought we'd never make it. I thought that maybe my channel had sort of plateaued and that YouTube was like, that's enough when it comes to showing my videos to people. But anyway, I was blown away by the Grim Fandango video and how it did. I thought that video would at most do okay, but it is now a record holder on my channel, and it's not even close. It has close to 200,000 views so far, and that is like 10 times higher than my second best performing video. And it's funny because I misspoke in the recording and said spum instead of scum, and I didn't catch it while I was recording, but I caught it in editing, and I figured, usually when I make a mistake like that, I'll go back and re-record, but I was like, this video is gonna get like 800 views, who gives a shit? And then it became it became the highest viewed video on my channel, and now that mistake's gonna be there forever. Anyway, the video I put out after Grim Fandango was the Half-Life video, and it didn't do nearly as well as the Grim Fandango video, but it still did better than my videos usually do. Before Grim Fandango, my videos averaged around 900 views, which isn't great by any metric. Usually my videos would get around 400 or 500, and I had like 5 videos that maybe got 20,000 and skewed the average. So the Half-Life video getting around 8,000 views is actually pretty decent for my channel, even if it didn't quite reach the Grim Fandango levels. But anyway, I'm blown away, and it's crazy. It's just crazy. I'm in disbelief that we made it to 5,000 so fast. And before I could even get the 5,000 sub celebration all put together, we had already reached 6,000, which is insane. So I just want to thank you all so much. As of this video going up, I am still demonetized. My entire channel is still demonetized. I reapplied on Monday. That's when the 90 days was up, which is when they let you reapply every 90 days. So I reapplied. And to their credit, they didn't immediately respond 15 minutes later telling me no. They waited 5 days to tell me no. Just to, get my hopes up and waste my time. Yeah, and they still won't elaborate. It's like I'm not even making any demands. I'm just like, can you guys literally just tell me what I did wrong so I know what not to do in the future? And they're like, no. So, bye, I guess. So if you want to support me, I do have my Patreon. It's in the description like it always is. Anything you can donate. My lowest tier is $2. Anything is fine. Thank you to everybody who joined up in the last month or so. I went from having like 3 patrons to having like 14. And honestly, that's a more consistent income than I was ever getting from YouTube ads anyway. So yeah, I really appreciate all you guys. Thank you so much for that. I mean, when it comes to the demonetization thing, it's not even about the money. That's not really why I'm upset. I mean, yeah, that sucks, but like I still have my day job. So like worst case scenario, I'll just stop making YouTube videos and I'll be right back where I was like 5 years ago, just working a regular job. And now I'll have way more free time. So it's not even that. It's just the fact that I'm being punished for something I did not do. And I'm being given no recourse, no avenue to even plead my case. YouTube won't hear me out on this at all because that's by design. They don't want anybody to actually be able to dispute any of this shit, which is why people have to go make a fuss on social media to actually get anything done. But anyway, I've been rambling too long, so I'm going to cut this short. But thank you guys so much. Like and subscribe, Patreon in the description. I'll have more videos coming, and you guys just keep doing what you're doing, whatever that is. Yeah, we'll see you.